Ukraine is spiraling to what is, I think, a momentous defeat, and a defeat that's coming a lot quicker than I think many people predicted, especially in the collective West, especially in the foreign policy establishment. Now, this defeat takes on many forms, and we're going to get into those forms. But one of the forms that it's taking now is an out and out manpower shortage. And this should come as no surprise. Ukraine has burnt through several armies since February 2022 that NATO attempted to arm and fund to the teeth. And now there really is nothing left. There have been many reports, of course, about all of the various ways that Ukraine has tried to address manpower shortages, including conscripting older women, children, etc., but none of it is working. So you have many fronts now where Ukraine is at a complete disadvantage. It's on the weapons front, the ammunition front, the political and diplomatic front, if anyone has been paying attention to that, where you have all across the board, even in the collective West, doubts about the future of Ukraine's war effort. Then there's the fact that manpower is starting to diminish, meaning that there are literally not enough troops, not enough soldiers for Ukraine to keep sending out onto the front lines. And again, this should come as no surprise. The counteroffensive alone, now on an official pause, even though there is some pretty heavy fighting at Avdiivka. I keep saying that wrong, but there's some pretty heavy fighting in that area of Ukraine. All of it points to Russia continue to make gains, and the counteroffensive as an overall military strategy is on pause, precisely because 90,000 Ukrainian troops, 90,000, were killed in action. That is a lot of manpower. And this doesn't even get to the fact that before this even started, the EU had conservative estimates of over 100,000 killed in action, when many believe it was twice to 3 times that many. So we're talking about massive, and I mean massive, manpower losses, just out and out mass death. Russia inflicting heavy casualties. So these issues are starting to bubble to the surface. They're being admitted more and more by even the mainstream media in the collective West. So the manpower shortage in particular is of particular interest to CNN of late. They wrote, as the war grinds on, Ukraine needs more troops. Not everyone is ready to enlist. So I want to pay attention. We're not going to read the whole article, but there are some interesting, what I think the article, what CNN is trying to communicate to its readers, which tend to be on the neocon side of the political spectrum. What are they communicating through this article about this problem? So they said, on the global stage, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been consistently on message. In visits to Washington and other Western capitals, he has focused on keeping Kiev supplied with more advanced arms, ammunition, and financing. At home, however, he faces a human resources problem. The war is approaching the end of its second year, and Ukraine's military needs more manpower to sustain a bloody war of attrition against Russia, a country with more than 3 times the population of Ukraine. Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's top military commander, wrote in a recent essay acknowledging that training and recruiting troops was becoming a serious challenge. The prolonged nature of the war, limited opportunities for the rotation of soldiers on the line of contact, gaps in legislation that seem to legally evade mobilization, significantly reduced the motivation of citizens to serve with the military. It acknowledged a bleak reality, Zaluzhny did. Ukraine needs more people in uniform, and it needs them now. How serious is this challenge? The issue is clouded in part by official secrecy. So this is a running theme. So we don't even really know how challenging this problem is. We don't really know because it is a secret. Kind of sounds like how the United States is being secretive about its arms sales and arms packages now to Israel as it conducts an assault on Gaza. So there's a lot of secrecy when it comes to these wars. Kiev does not publicly disclose its manpower targets, nor does it reveal the total number of dead and wounded, although casualties on both sides since February 22 are estimated to number in the hundreds of thousands. And mind you, a lot less on the Russian side. There are mainstream sources that point to less than 100,000 on the Russian side. But nonetheless, this is the mainstream media, and they are going to try to create a false equivalency. Ukraine fills its ranks with volunteers, but also has a system of conscription that allows the state to draft men of military age. After the invasion, Ukraine imposed martial law. All males of 18 to 60 were considered liable for military service under this martial law and could be mobilized unless they were eligible for deferment. In 2023, the rules of military registration were updated to include women. Both measures stopped short of full conscription. Martial law introduced draconian travel restrictions. Men between 18 and 60 are generally barred from exiting the country, although there's a wide range of exemptions covering from everything from single parents of young children to professional athletes. And mind you, a lot of Ukrainians left anyway. A lot of them did. A lot of them went to Russia. A lot of them went to other countries. A lot of Ukrainians ended up leaving anyway. While it's difficult to get exact portraits of how Ukrainians are responding to the call to serve in the military, officials have acknowledged publicly that evading military service and enforcing mobilization is an issue. At a briefing November 9th, State Border Service of Ukrainian spokesperson Andrei Demchenko said that in over the last 10 months, 43,000 citizens of Ukraine were refused exit at the border, meaning you have a mass exodus of Ukrainians not wanting to fight. The reasons were different, but mostly because they did not qualify. Right. The war is sometimes simplified as an industrial context. Ukraine's Western backers are racing to produce ammunition for Kiev as Moscow ramps up domestic production of artillery shells and seeks supplies, of course, from North Korea. They always have to point that out. But it's also a recruitment contest against Russia. Mobilization is a matter of survival for Ukraine, blah, blah. They don't even say anything really important. They're just posing the problem. But look at these highlights. This is what Ukrainian soldiers are saying, Ukrainian troops and people who are either in or considering to join the Ukrainian armed forces. If the war continues, as it is today, there's no way to avoid conscription, says Major Victor Kasil in the Kartia Brigade. So he was in charge of recruiting. Civilians have become too relaxed, says Mark Hovley, 29, who's a civilian volunteer supporting the military. He's willing to be mobilized. So civilians are too relaxed. The rate of sexism is pretty high in the army, says Maria Zaika, 31, at a pharmacy network. She's ready to register for service. So you see how they're talking to everyone who's supposedly ready, but they're giving you alarming messages of the problem. What has this country given me? Says Yevhin, 32, an IT specialist. It is not the steel that win, it's the spirit. Okay, I strengthen the GDP of this country. He wants to avoid conscription because he works and he doesn't want to die. They do not realize what they're getting into, says an Army Lieutenant, Dmitro Kostyuk, currently undergoing rehabilitation after being wounded in July. So, do you see what's happening here? This is not just about the conscription issue. This is about the losing war effort. When you have even these are the most enthusiastic volunteers, the most enthusiastic members of the armed forces that they wanted to interview about the problem of conscription. All of them are sounding the alarm about major problems, both internally and with the war effort. So all in all, what CNN has pointed out is a major problem that is not getting a lot of attention, which is Ukraine. They always talk about weapons. And yeah, weapons are important. But if you have nobody to fire the weapons, well, you lose. You lose the war. That's what happens. If you do not have people, and this is the thing with modern warfare, robotics, and AI, and all this stuff, we're all supposed to think that big tech is going to fight all the wars for us. But in a war like this one that NATO provoked, that NATO built up for, this is a war that requires manpower. This is how NATO decided to fight this war. It really was the only way. They had to sacrifice basically all of Ukraine in order to fight this kind of war, any kind of war with Russia. And here now we are seeing the major consequences. And remember, the Ukrainian armed forces is not simply a military that is of indigenous Ukrainians, so to speak. Foreign mercenaries from the very beginning were viewed as not just additional support, but critical to the overall war effort. And now you have them abandoning the Ukrainian armed forces. Fresh troops who arrive to fight for Kiev often say they did not realize how bad the situation is, says Lieutenant Dmitry Katsyuk. Many foreign mercenaries recruited by Ukraine soon opt to flee the country after experiencing the gruesome reality on the battlefield, said this army officer on CNN again. Moscow has previously said that Kiev is using soldiers from other countries as cannon fodder to breach Russian defenses. In an interview with the American network, Lieutenant Dmitry Kostyuk said that his platoon, which was deployed not far from Artyomovsk, also known as Bakhmut, a scene of fierce fighting in recent months, ran short of personnel and was replenished by 12 foreign fighters. According to the officer, while some mercenaries join the fray because they are attracted to the romance of war, others go because they see fighting as their professional activity or because it is a good line on their resume. So, again, these aren't necessarily reasons that offer a lot of inspiration, a lot of enthusiasm, right? When you go to war because you want something on your resume, it's not likely that you're going to stay in a job that could lead to almost certain death. So Kostyuk noted that, unlike Ukrainian citizens, foreigners are free to terminate a contract with the military. After seeing what the hostilities look like, almost half of the people said, no, this is too much. This is not the kind of war we signed up for. He also criticized the mobilization campaign, which has been marred by numerous corruption scandals and draft dodging, by noting that Ukraine's attempts to force its citizens to join the army produce soldiers who are reluctant to fight. So the Russian military has warned foreign mercenaries recruited by Ukraine that they are viewed as a legitimate target, launching long-range missiles on their training camps on numerous occasions. In July, Defense Ministry in Moscow said that throw units of foreign mercenaries into so-called meat grinder assaults on Russian positions, with those injured troops being the last to be evacuated. So this is what Kiev does. They throw units with foreign mercenaries into the meat grinder so that they can be the last to be evacuated. Essentially, they are the definition of cannon fodder. So around the same time, Moscow estimated that since the hostilities, more than 11,000 foreign mercenaries had arrived in Ukraine, with almost 5,000 of them fleeing the country after seeing how they were being treated by the military and local authorities. The number of foreign fighters in the Ukrainian army was estimated at just over 2,000, according to the defense ministry. So an exodus. You're having an exodus of the foreign mercenaries, which, while critical, I mean, we're talking about over 10,000 of them being recruited to aid in the war effort. Many of them are leaving. Many of them are saying, can't do this anymore, to the point where it has shriveled down to just a few thousand. So now we definitely have to talk about the weapons issue, because as you have probably been following, there has been a complete shift in the aid to Ukraine that has been a staple. Most of the time when we're talking about Ukraine, we are highlighting these ghastly packages, right? Overall, and there's been over 40 plus billion in military aid alone, and over 100 plus billion in overall aid from the United States. This is from the United States alone. Then you add several more billion from Europe. So we're usually talking about, okay, there's more coming in. And over time, especially as the counteroffensive began, especially as it started, we saw these packages getting smaller and smaller in size. And now what you're seeing is talks about outsourcing the problem of ammunition, of weapons, not from the United States, but to Europe. So this is what the New York Times had to say. Europe moves to fill weapons gaps amid doubts about U.S. commitments to Ukraine. You have Germany, Norway, Britain, and others increasing weapons production to help Kiev. But the aid may be coming too late as winter looms and Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia stalls. So here you have direct admonition. You have a direct admission that this is not going to be enough anyway, even if the United States wanted to order its European vassals to do its bidding for it. Hey, make these weapons, step up production, and help Kiev with its ongoing proxy war. No, it's just not even possible. So here is what Laura Jakes has to say over the New York Times. Faced with growing American reluctance to send more military aid to Ukraine, European leaders are moving to fill the gap, vowing new support for Kiev as it battles Russia in a war in Europe's backyard. Several countries, including Germany, Britain, and Norway, are increasing production of weapons, especially the artillery ammunition that Ukraine so badly needs. Germany, once a laggard in providing aid to Ukraine, announced a week ago it planned to double its support to 8.5 billion in 2024 and would deliver more crucial air defense systems by the end of the year. And EU states are gearing up to train an additional 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers, bringing the total up to 40,000. We really have to step up our game here, says Cashapp Lengren, the Dutch defense minister, said at a forum this month at the Glendale Institute, a think tank funded by the Dutch government. But that may be little comfort to Ukraine, where counteroffensive against aiding Russian forces has stalled as winter approaches, and officials say more support is needed now, even as countries turn their attention to the Israel-Gaza war. In a worrying sign, the EU appears likely to fail an early test of its ability to sustain backing for Ukraine. A much-touted pledge to donate 1 million rounds of 155 millimeter caliber shells within 1 year to Ukraine is now widely expected to fall short. The million will not be reached. We must assume it, Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius said this week, acknowledging the bloc will miss the March deadline. European officials have long worried that rising Republican opposition to military support that the United States is sending to Ukraine, 45 billion in weapons and equipment so far, would diminish the leading American role in fighting the war should Biden lose the election. So here we have direct admissions that European support is not going to be going far enough. And they're still concerned about the Republicans. You would think that a war that has gotten this much bipartisan support up until this point would be able to yield results. But as we've said on this program many times before, there are limits. There are limits to military capacity. And here, the United States has stretched its empire very thin. It was not prepared to fight a protracted war of attrition of a World War I like scale. It just wasn't ready to do that. And arguably, it was never going to be ready to do that because that is not how the United States generally attempts to fight wars. What we are seeing with Israel now, that's generally how the United States likes to fight wars, generally likes to cause instability and chaos via proxy. It doesn't like when it has to essentially arm its proxies to the teeth to fight a great power like Russia. This is where the United States ultimately miscalculated, and it's why we see the problems we're seeing now with the military situation. And so they talk about the standoff and the funding, and they talk about Joseph Borrell said, of course, that Europeans supposedly have the means to do so, have to be willing politically and materially to help Ukraine and continue to do so, even take over from the United States if, as is likely, its support diminishes. So I don't even have to go on more because that is Jungle Joseph Borrell. The article already acknowledged that Europe does not have the ability to make up what the United States even was providing, and that wasn't enough to sustain real achievements on the battlefield. But you have Jungle Joseph Borrell talking as if it is a possibility. Well, reality bites. And here is another dose of reality. So even well before that article came out, it was always a ridiculous assertion to think that Europe, this is back in October, to think that Europe could actually make up for the shortfall. Here's Voice of America, basically a CIA rag, says NATO warns of ammunition shortages due to the war in Ukraine. NATO's senior military officials warned European ammunition stocks are running short as the West continues to send large amounts of military aid to Ukraine to fend off Russian forces. This was Admiral Robert Bauer, who chairs the NATO Military Committee, said Europe needed to ramp up production as the war enters its 20th month. So now we are getting actually up to we're in the 21st month. And of course, we're heading to 2 years. We now give away weapon systems to Ukraine, which is great, and ammunition, but not from full warehouses. We started to give away from half full or lower warehouses in Europe. And therefore, the bottom of the barrel is now visible, and we need the industry to ramp up production in a much higher tempo. We need large volumes, said Bauer, telling delegates at the Warsaw Security Forum, adding that political leaders needed to act faster. We need the continued support from the political level because it's not only the money, it is also the actions in the nations that lead to more readier forces and capabilities we need. And if you actually see that in 7 years before the war, the defense budgets went up already, but the industry did not increase the production capacity. And that has led to higher prices from before the war. So essentially what he's admitting is that there is this huge push to increase defense spending, but it doesn't translate into the results because what's happening. These corporations are essentially pocketing much as profit. Let's be honest here. This is how the military industrial complex works. But the point is that the military industrial complex, especially these arms manufacturers, don't really bank on fighting a war that's going to stretch their outputs thin. They don't predict that because their whole model is based on profit. It's based on ensuring that whatever distribution model that it's able to generate only generates just enough to ensure profit maximization. Anything more means cutting into the pie that these major corporations want to essentially gobble up. So you already had that problem, but that only touches the surface of what the issue is here. And the issue is that the way that Ukraine was fighting anyway, it was horribly wasteful, firing thousands of rounds and shells daily. It just was never sustainable. And so Voice of America had already admitted as much, had already reported on this well over a month before. Reports now talking about manpower shortages and, of course, Europe taking over. I mean, this is the fantasy world that the collective West is living in. They're kind of recycling story after story. They're kind of recycling justification after justification for their limitations. And all of it points to a spiraling defeat, an unprecedented spiraling defeat. And so now we have Lloyd Austin, you have um, Antony Blinken making several visits. You had the CIA chief, William Burns, make a visit to Kiev. Now you have Lloyd Austin going. He arrived in the Ukrainian capital to affirm steadfast support. It seems like now, uh, every time a U.S. Representative, every time someone from the Department of Defense or the State Department, Blinken, Austin, go, they're having to basically come out and say, I'm here today to deliver an important message. We continue to stand with Ukraine. We steadfast support, and we understand you have urgent battlefield needs, but none of it translates to actual change. And because this is all about saving face and buying time, but time is essentially running out for Ukraine. It's running out for NATO in this arena. It's why they are so enthusiastically investing so much time and resources into West Asia so Israel can continue its onslaught. There's a big reason why this is happening. It's because Ukraine is not so much a priority. If Ukraine, reminder, if Ukraine had some prospect of victory over Russia to really stick it in the eye of Russia, weaken them, militarily, politically, economically, if that was a possibility, there would be a ceasefire in Gaza already, because it would mean that the United States could actually achieve one of its imperial objectives, and it wouldn't really care what Israel wanted to do. It would ensure that whatever was in its best interest was done, but that's not happening here. So here we have, lastly, Ukraine must brace for loss of U.S. support, said ex-ambassador Valerie to Ukraine, Valerie Chaley. Republican opposition is complicating White House efforts to support the country's military. So the former envoy to Washington from Kiev, Valerie Chaley, said that Ukraine should brace for potential political crisis in the U.S. that could undermine further military assistance with the embattled nation. Now, let me tell you one thing. There will be no political crisis around Israel and Gaza. Right? So this is fundamentally different. This is about one war starting and another one ending. Let us be clear here. Out of the three scenarios that we've been talking about for a long time, our government has, for some reason, considered the most optimistic scenario. What is happening now is actually the worst case scenario. So again, trouble. We don't know what's going to happen next. It's clear that there will be a decrease in aid. I expect this level of support will not decrease drastically until the summer. But we now have to think about the fall next year, when the U.S. will most likely enter a political crisis, and it will be difficult to close the budget for the year. So really what a lot of these forces are talking about is that Ukraine not really having passed the next year. Some are saying months when it comes to the battlefield situation. But in terms of the next year, what a lot of people are predicting is that the slowdown around this conflict is going to be so grave that it essentially will not exist as it did prior, meaning that Ukraine lost. So spiraling to defeat is exactly what is happening here. Ukraine is now yesterday in terms of significance to the US foreign policy establishment, to NATO. They are trying to keep playing up that there is possibilities for rectification and of course for some kind of victory. But we're hearing all of the rumors, the reports about peace talks potentially, about pushing Zelensky, about political changes in Kiev possibly. We've had over and over again, whenever you hear rumors or reports like that, you better believe that all options are on the table. And I think the biggest option now on the table is the slow and steady descent of Ukraine into yesterday's war so that there can be a regrouping. And the regrouping now is happening and coalescing around what Israel is doing in Gaza, what it's doing to Palestine. But that too will have a sense of temporary relief, because that too cannot last as it is going on right now. There will be changes coming there too. So, really, we're talking about a chicken with its head cut off. That's what the U.S. empire is. It doesn't really know which direction to run, where it should point its guns next. But we do know that Ukraine is spiraling into defeat, that Zelensky, the only thing that NATO largesse has done is to make himself literally fat with arrogance, with hubris, and of course, with the utter corruption that comes with being a puppet regime of the empire. So there has been no victory. In fact, the defeat is already here. It is just how deep and how badly it will eventually turn out to be once the dust has settled on this proxy war. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.